So first of all, just a word about the HBMA. HBMA is an organization that represents a number of revenue cycle management companies, professional billers, professional billing departments. And it's organized basically for education, much as you are experiencing here, and advocacy. The Government Relations Committee is a group of volunteers within the HBMA that get together once a month. We do a conference call once a month, discuss government regulations, pending policy, pending legislation, and looking at what is it that we may be able to do to educate the government officials on what their policies are likely to do in terms of administrative burden, and to try to get them to understand any unintended consequences that they may have. So that's basically who HBMA is, what we do. But I want to launch in today to talk about several things that are happening and where the top issues are in the 116th Congress. The 116th Congress, of course, was elected last year. It runs through the end of 2020. And these are the things that I'll be touching on this afternoon. A little bit about the ACA, repeal and replace, and more on Medicare for All and what that means and how people are thinking about it. When I say people, I'm talking about how the government's thinking about it. And then surprise medical bills. Surprise bills have popped up recently as a major issue. The White House has become involved in it. There are a number of things walking through the legislature regarding this, and I think that some of the things that are contemplated will have some significant effects on you guys as billers and also as providers. Okay, so for ACA, it's interesting that they didn't probably think they were doing this, but Republicans and Democrats were kind of getting to the same place about what they wanted to do with the ACA. And there seemed to be general agreement that they wanted to repeal it, either repeal it or do major fixes to it, and then to replace it. The problem was they couldn't figure out what to replace it with. You remember the 115th Congress, and the 115th Congress really tried to just repeal the Affordable Care Act. And that famous video of John McCain walking in and giving his thumbs down, that stopped that from happening. But they were not sure what to replace it with. And that's still not something which is very well thought through, or certainly nothing that has any kind of agreement on. However, what about Medicare for All? So is that a replacement? Well, first of all, what's in the name here? If you call it Medicare for All, about 2/3 of the country likes the idea. If you take the same program, but you call it universal health care, support stays about the same. But when you start getting down into national health care or single payer plan, support begins to fall. And particularly when you get down to the national single payer plan, people say, hey, wait a second, if it's single payer, that means that I'm going to lose my insurance. I don't like this. If you call it socialized medicine, not many people like it. And not only that, the number of people that feel it's very negative significantly increases. We are definitely a capitalist society. So when you talk about socialism, people take a step back. So first of all, you need to know that there is no possibility that Medicare for All is going to pass in the 116th Congress. No possibility. You can bet everything you own and everything that the person sitting next to you owns on this. It's not going to happen. However, you're going to hear a lot about it. If you have been at all following the debates that the Democratic candidates, multiple plurals, have had, you will have heard that Medicare for All is a major topic that is going on in those debates. And you can expect that on the campaign trail, you're going to hear this happen, this discussion happen over and over. However, depending on who that nominee ends up, you may or may not hear it when it comes down to actually running against whoever the Republican nominee is for president. If, in fact, you have Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, even Kamala Harris, it'll probably be front and center. If you have somebody, which is not as likely, but if you have somebody like Delaney or Ryan, Klobuchar, those guys are not supportive of Medicare for all, so you probably won't hear much in the campaign about it. But what's important is that of the Medicare for all bills that have been introduced, none of them actually are Medicare for all, not as we know it. It's really single payer. If you really want to do Medicare for all you have to do is take the Medicare law as is and simply just change the pages to talk about eligibility. And instead of saying, well, you've got to be either 65 or you've got to be disabled, you've got to be the child of somebody who is, before you're eligible for Medicare, you just simply say, if you're a resident of the United States, you're eligible for Medicare, done deal. And that doesn't take a whole lot to do. But I think all of you know that Congress is not really happy when they get a law that doesn't take a whole lot to do. So this is something that isn't going to happen. So there are two bills, a Senate bill and a House bill, that have in fact been introduced. Both of them are called Medicare for All. You'll note that it has 108 co-sponsors in the House and 14 co-sponsors in the Senate. So it's not overwhelming support, but nevertheless, there is some support for this thing. So what does the new Medicare do? Well, first of all, it eliminates co-pays and co-insurance deductibles. So you're all out there thinking, it's not so bad. I don't have to pay when I go to the doc. No, you don't, because it also prohibits balance billing. Now, not only are you now happy that you don't have to pay when you go to the doctor, you're also happy that you don't have to send any patient statements. It also prevents the provider from charging anything for the services that would be covered under the new Medicare. But it does expand the Medicare benefits. You would expect that. Medicare has a somewhat limited suite of benefits that it covers. So if you're going to have it be the health care coverage of the United States, you would expect it to actually expand those services. But we begin to get into the fun part here, as it will essentially eliminate commercial insurance. Now, when you talk about how much of a chance this has, you will have fairly well-funded, fairly organized corporations that would be against the elimination of commercial insurance. But it also eliminates Medicaid. You would expect that. It's just rolled into Medicare and other federal health care programs except for VA and Indian Health. Medicare for All, those two bills, would make it unlawful for a private payer to compete with Medicare. So if Medicare covers something, the private commercial insurance could not sell a policy that also covers that. Even if you wanted to buy something from Aetna or wanted to buy something from Blue Cross, instead of using Medicare, you would not be able to do that. It also says, okay, how about your ERISA plans? Let's stop those from competing with Medicare also. So those are also written into the law saying that an employer cannot offer benefits that compete with Medicare. And they're getting, pretty well thought through on this one. You cannot offer it to your employees or your former employees or the employees' dependents or your former employees' dependents. They're making sure that you don't do this. If Medicare, however, doesn't offer the service, you're welcome to contract and actually provide services or coverage for those services. Payments to the docs, or hospitals, or any provider actually, would in fact be based on a given fee schedule. We'll talk about that in a second. And that payment would be considered payment in full. Keep in mind that no more patient statements, no more deductibles, so you've got just simply the one payment that's coming from the new Medicare. So not later than 1 year after whenever this bill would be enacted, there would be a requirement for the secretary to come up with this fee schedule. Now, I don't know if it was in the law that said that not later than 1 year after we decided to do ICD-10, we would actually move to ICD-10. Things in Washington never happen measured in years without an S. So these things would take a lot of time. There'd be a lot of people coming out of the woodwork that would say, well, this should be paid at this rate, that should be paid at that rate. A lot of folks that do have, in fact, a vested interest in what that fee schedule is like. This is a bit of a diversion or a digression, is the current proposed fee schedule that Medicare put out. I don't know who read it. It's 1,700 pages long, so show of hands, who read that thing? All right. But part of it talks about what changes would happen if they went ahead with the changes in E&M coding that they're thinking about doing in 2021, where some specialties take a significant hit, like radiology is down 8%, for instance. There's a lot of vested interest, and that would be a very interesting activity or process to go through to come up with a fee schedule. As far as prescription drugs are concerned, the secretary, it's going to be a busy guy, has to negotiate what that fee for drugs will be. And he has to take in, he or she has to take into account these following factors. You have to do a comparative clinical effectiveness from an impartial source if it's available. Now, forgive my cynicism. By the way, forgiving my cynicism is something I'm going to be asking you to do multiple times during this talk, is that the impartial sources would tend to go away after maybe the first couple of years. But if there is that out there, he must take that into consideration. So this one kind of makes sense, the budgetary impact of providing coverage for that drug. It's a combination of how often is that drug prescribed and what's the cost of the drug to understand the budgetary impact. But basically it means that the more often the drug is prescribed, either the less likely the secretary will cover it or the less that that person is going to want to pay for it. And of course, is there something else out there that does the same thing that's cheaper? And I don't think anybody here would think that was a bad idea. And it's one of the few things that seem to make sense here, but this is my favorite. They've got to take into an account the total revenues from global sales on this particular drug and how much they've spent in research and development. So basically, again, the drug company is looking at this and saying, okay, so the more I sell of this drug globally, the less you want to pay me for it. That is generally not a good business model, but that is something that is in the law. So this process would be going forward, and the research and development part reminds me of Paramount Pictures a few years ago. So Paramount Pictures was, you may remember this, was sued by some actors whose contracts said that they received a portion of the profit of the films that they were in. And magically, none of those films made a profit. Well, it's my thinking that magically the cost of research and development of these drugs will be at least as much as they're receiving in revenue on these drugs. And so when you take that into an account, the prices will remain high. not later than September 1st, the secretary, who I said was a busy guy, has come up with a national health care budget. I'm not going to read this slide. You have it in your packet. But the national health care budget is something, again, which would be interesting in terms of the number of different special interests that would be wanting to get involved in that particular process. Also, I think you all recognize that it takes a long time to get the Congress to agree on a budget. So coming up with a national health care budget is not something that is reasonable, I think, to expect. There is hereby created a trust fund to be known as the Universal Medicare Trust Fund. Now, this is not going to be, don't confuse this with the current Medicare Trust Fund, which may go bankrupt in 10 years. This is a new trust fund, and it's being created by this act. And the second one is fun, that the fund would consist of gifts and bequests, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I know that you guys are in the revenue cycle management industry, and so I know that you're all making bank. And I know this. I know this going on. And I know that you're all thinking that, you know, when I die, what am I going to do with all that money? Medicare Trust Fund may be an option. They may bail you out. The other money is going to come from the Medicare program itself, as you would expect, not counting, of course, the premiums, because those would be going away, and the other parts of the Medicare or the federal health care programs that can move the money, shift the money from where they're being spent now to the Medicare Trust Fund. However, these are other programs that are there, and please note that VA and Indian Health are explicitly excluded from this law. I don't have a reason why that's true. I've not asked anybody, and I don't know. But it ain't going to be enough. So where is that additional money going to come from? Well, many employers pay for health care for their staffs. That will no longer be necessary because, after all, Medicare for all is Medicare for all, and everybody gets that. So instead of having premiums that the employer will pay, the employer will be taxed. Now, they have learned a lesson, they being whoever wrote this bill, has learned a lesson on the ACA, that you can't charge a fee because that's unconstitutional, so you charge a tax. So straight out of the box, this is going to be a tax on employers. I don't know how it's going to be calculated. How it's going to be calculated is actually not in the law. In fact, much in the law really says to HHS, please fill in the gaps and make this work for us. This is one of those gaps. So that is a portion of where the money is coming from. And then there are people that pay for insurance out of their pocket. And since commercial insurance, for all intents and purposes, is going away, that money is now going to be moved over to the Medicare Trust Fund. And that's the idea of how they're going to pay for it. It's Bernie Sanders' idea that that's where the money is going to come from. And by the way, Sanders is now making healthcare, Medicare for all, being basically the cornerstone of his campaign. So you will hear that a lot over the next few months. In case you didn't know what it was that the people who wrote this law were after, this is in the law. It is the sense of Congress. I probably should send chills up and down your spine when the word sense and Congress are used in the same sentence. But it is the sense of Congress. You have tens of millions of people in the US that don't have health care, which is true. Billions of dollars of profit that really should have gone to their health care. Therefore, the Medicare for All Act is intended to remove profit from the healthcare system. Now, I don't know if that gets down to the level that we deal with it here. It may. It may be that you can't show a profit if you're dealing with this. But the intent is to remove the profit. And as you read there, that it can't be used to increase net revenues, to even establish net revenues. You can't use it for marketing purposes. It really does say, nope, every dime that we spend has to go to healthcare. So the question is anybody actually making money? Well, last year was a bad year. And if you're following things, today was a bad day. But last year was a bad year for a lot of different places, a lot of different sectors of the economy. But healthcare did well. So let's take a look at that. So Dow Jones was down 5.5%, and other areas of the economy all dropping. Real estate also down 5.5%. Financial and the energy sector is getting hit. And all of that is negative except for healthcare, which has gone up almost 5%. So even if you're feeling that we're not making money, the investors are feeling that we are. Okay, so moving on to surprise bills. So what is a surprise bill? Who does it protect? What are the rules? And that sort of thing is what I intend to cover. So if you can't read this, it says, first we're going to run some tests to see how your insurance reacts. So this slide, I just want to tell you guys that I worked very hard on this slide. It took me a long time to put this one together. I decided that I wanted to give you a comprehensive list of all the things about surprise billing, both its causes and what to do about it, that people agreed on. So I put this slide together to give you that list, and I know it's comprehensive, so I'll give you a few moments to read it. Congress has their idea of surprise bill, and they see surprise billing as when a patient receives a bill from an out-of-network provider that they didn't know was out-of-network. That is their definition of surprise bill, and that can come in two different flavors. That can come as an emergency service, where the patient really didn't have a choice, or in a scheduled service. So let's look at those two quickly. On emergency services, obviously your first concern is not what the insurance is going to pay or who's in network, who's not. It's just getting the patient to wherever is the best place for that person to be treated. So all of the legislation covers surprise billing in that scenario. And we'll talk about what it is that they cover. But in that scenario, it is covered. If it's not an emergency, if this is scheduled, then the surprise billing definition moves to the patient was never told that a provider that was not in their network was going to be working with them. There is a requirement in virtually all the legislation that's been proposed that the patient sign a form that says they've been informed and they agree that a non-network provider is going to be working on their case. And it's sort of like an ABN now for Medicare. And the out-of-network surprise billing protections would occur if that form doesn't exist. From a patient perspective, a surprise bill can also be a case where you are going to an emergency room and you're thinking it's an emergency, but your payer says, no, it's not. So you suddenly have a bill from whatever emergency room you went to. Sometimes a surprise bill from a patient perspective is a high deductible. And also, and this happens, as you know, frequently, that a patient will go to a provider that used to be in their network, that was dropped from their network, and they received no notification of that happening. So they did not know that this was an out-of-network provider. There are patients that I know that I work with who also consider what they call a surprise medical bill is a medical bill. Okay, so these are some of the scenarios where that surprise billing can happen. You have somebody who does go to an in-network hospital. They're seen by a non-network provider. They assume that everybody there would be a network provider and was not. A health plan, as I mentioned before, decides that what a prudent layperson would think is an emergency actually wasn't. And so since you went to a or out-of-network hospital because it was the closest hospital, then you suddenly get a surprise bill. Now, I lied to my wife yesterday, and I told her that I wasn't going to bring this up, but I'll bring it up. So it was Christmas Eve, and she was cooking. She's a good cook. She was cooking. And she decided that she was going to cut her finger off. Don't know what led to this, but that's what she almost did. So we're covered under Kaiser insurance. The nearest hospital was not Kaiser. I did not take her to the Kaiser hospital. I took her to the nearest hospital. To me, that is prudent layperson definition of an emergency. So they sewed her up and got everything together, and everything was fine. But then we had to fight a bit with Kaiser to say, no, this really was an emergency, and no, we weren't going to drive 25 miles to the nearest Kaiser facility to have her finger sewed back on. I mean, it's just, but this type of thing can happen, and this is something which results in surprise billing. So tier one, I've broken surprise billing down to a couple of tiers. Tier one surprise billing really is what's out there, what people think of, and the thing that makes the media, and certainly the Congress, in terms of what surprise billing is caused by. So you have hospitals, of course, that negotiate and contract with groups. Those contracts have nothing to do with what the in-network contracts the hospital has, and so you could very well have an emergency department that is not contracted with any payer that the hospital is contracted with. And so that is a generation of a generator of surprise billing. Patients really aren't aware of this type of thing, and there's no reason to expect the level of sophistication that is required. That you go to a hospital, it's an in-network hospital, patients really aren't going to stop and ask, oh, but are the doctors that work here in network? It's reasonable to assume that they are. My tier two reason is the underlying reason of the underlying reason, and that is narrow networks and the fact that insurance companies do not always negotiate fairly with their particular providers. Unfortunately, physicians have been late to the table, and insurance companies have been driving this narrative. And so most of the solutions that the government has come up with has been very favorable to insurance companies. And this factor, which is something that the GR committee, HBMA, pointed out, wasn't really considered. So the Washington fix is there's two different things that need to be fixed. One, patients have to be protected, and two, providers have to be paid. So patients would be protected this way. If it's an out-of-network service, then the patient only has to pay the amount that they would have paid if they were in network. And that amount will count to their out-of-pocket expense for their year. In addition to that, the providers cannot balance bill. You read those three things together, and what you've got is an in-network service. And with those three things together, it means that you cannot be out of network. If you are out of network, it doesn't matter because the patient will come in and all the in-network rules will apply. In terms of how to pay the provider, there's a couple of ways that those bills are going about it. Not in the same bill, but these are the breadth of solutions that are out there. One having to do with establishing a federal reimbursement rate. It's almost like Medicare for all, but it's based on something that's different. And arbitration. On the federal reimbursement rate, there are these possibilities. You can do a percentage of Medicare, and we're talking about like 120% of Medicare. We're not talking like 80% of Medicare, but 120% of Medicare, but has the underlying false assumption that Medicare is a worthwhile benchmark. The median in-network rate, half the guys are above it, half the guys are below it, and so this is what you're going to get. And a percent of provider charges. The ones that do carry, the proposals that do carry a percent of provider charges are usually around 80%. If it's arbitration, the arbitration is usually triggered by one side or the other. It doesn't happen automatically. Some of the bills allow you to bundle services. They all have a lower dollar amount, $1,000, $2,000. One that's been advanced out of committee that is $1,250, that it has to be at least that before you can get to arbitration. But the bills allow you to bundle it so that you can add like 3 $500 bills and get there. That the type of arbitration is baseball style. Now, for those of you that don't follow Major League Baseball, at least in terms of the negotiation between players and owners, baseball-style arbitration is one where the player says, pay me this, and the owner says, I'll pay you that. And it goes to arbitration, and the arbitrator must pick one or the other. There's no negotiation, there's no finding a middle ground, there's no like, well, I kind of like yours better than this person, so I'll lean that way. It is, I'll take your suggestion, or I'm going to take your suggestion. And in these laws, the arbitrator's decision is final. They do have to take these things into consideration, and some of them do make sense. The median in-network rate may not, and I'll be looking at that in a couple of minutes. But certainly the percentage, the skill level of the provider should mitigate against how much you're paying, and the other issues that are up there. Okay, so I'm not going to really go into these bills, but these bills are in your packet. You can look them up and read what they're like. Of note, the HR 3630 has been passed out of committee, and it was thought that it would be passed or at least voted on by the House before their August recess. That didn't happen, but you can be pretty sure it will happen in September. And the Senate bills, same thing, and 1865 has been passed and to the full Senate. Another bill that everybody was absolutely certain was going to be taken up by the full Senate and voted on prior to the recess. That also didn't happen. Almost certainly will be happening in September. But I want you to note bullet number 3, that bill gives you 45 days to bill the patient. That 45 days, that clock starts date of service, or the patient doesn't have to pay it. Now, maybe you're all better than I am, which could very well be true. I'm not going to argue that. But a lot of payers don't pay their bills in 45 days. A lot of times you're dealing with trying to get a claim paid. Maybe you're having to get medical records or whatever up to the payer. And you're trying to follow up and get that claim paid. But that 45-day clock is running. And you have no idea what to bill the patient until that insurance is paid. And you're stuck. That is something that certainly we'll be commenting on, but hopefully that will be changed in maybe 45 days from the time that the payer pays. So the Congressional Budget Office has done an assessment of these bills, and they think it's going to save $25 billion. Federal government will save $25 billion over the next 10 years. Now, I will admit that $2.5 billion a year is not a lot of money to the federal government, but nonetheless, it's a chunk that's enough to be talking about. So how do our friends at the CBO get there? Well, they figure that if this is enacted, or any one of these plans are enacted, the actual amount that providers will get paid is going to drop. When those payments to providers drop, insurance rates will go down. All right, another show of hands. Who thinks the insurance companies are going to lower their rates because they're paying the providers less? I'm sorry? Yes, unless you force them to do it. They're not being forced to do it. So the lower plan payments are going to end up because of, will end up creating the lower premiums. Then the lower premiums will then have a lower subsidy level at the ACA level. Now, the ACA level may not survive the appeals court in Texas or the Supreme Court, but if it does survive those tests, and ACA is still with us, the CBO says, well, we're not going to have to subsidize so much money, so that's going to save money. And the lower subsidies will result in the savings. So sort of like, your leg bones touches your hip bone and that sort of thing, is that this is a logic that says that because this happened over here, we're going to see all these other things, all these other dominoes fall, and we're going to end up with saving $25 billion over 10 years. It's important to note, however, that the CBO is assuming that that $25 billion is coming from providers, which it is, but that's not the only thing that's coming from providers. That ERISA plans will also fall in terms of their payments to providers. And so the actual amount, the actual impact on providers will be significantly higher. These are the guys that are most likely to be affected, at least initially, by surprise billing legislation. And if you bill for one of these specialties, it's more likely to affect you. So, as billing companies, what are our challenges? A few. First of all, if we're responsible for balanced billing, how do we know if a patient has signed a form that says that we can do this? In many cases, these will be hospital services. Emergency room, radiology, whatnot. The hospital would have gotten that form signed or not. How do we know? How do we find that out? Then how do we know what law the patient is covered under? The federal law is intended to fill in the gaps for state law. If you operate in multiple states, you will have to know what that state law is. You will also have to know what the federal law is and whether or not there are provisions in the federal law that also overlap or replace provisions in the state law. So it will become very messy to determine whether or not a patient can be balance billed. The laws are written that providers may have to bill the network rate. Well, first of all, how would you even know what that was? If you have a client that is an ED doc and he's seeing somebody, he's not an ED, he's not in the Blue Cross network, got a Blue Cross patient, you have to bill the in-network rate for Blue Cross. How do you know? Which Blue Cross? Which plan? Which network? How do you know? But nonetheless, this opens opportunity because the providers don't know either. So you may end up having to hire somebody that you call, this is my how do I know guy, who is checking all this stuff. But it is quite a service to be offering to providers. So the HBMA did a policy framework thing that I'm not going to talk about a whole lot, but we looked at all of this and came up with our suggestions, and it's primarily focused on, hey, the payer has a major responsibility in all of this, and so here are the issues that we need to be looking at in terms of payers. And we focus that a lot on network adequacy. So it's important to know this is not a partisan issue. Whether you're sitting out there as a Democrat or as a Republican, doesn't matter. This has broad bipartisan support. It really is, however, a payer versus provider issue. Providers came to the table late, so you have the payers driving the narrative. Protecting the patient and lowering federal cost, this is a win. You're not going to talk any legislator out of it. So this is something is about how to do this rather than whether to do this. So some thoughts. First of all, when you talk about the median in-network rate, this is a moving target. And a concern, I think, that is valid is that you're going to see insurance companies dropping providers who are above that median rate. And since you all took 7th grade math, you know that when that happens, the median rate falls. So then you have providers that are above that median rate. And you can keep doing this until you get some pretty severe median in-network rates. There's already examples that are coming out of the woodwork now about, in anticipation of these laws being passed, that insurance companies are dropping providers that are on the higher side of their network. And by doing so, not only are they forcing them into median rates, they're also dropping what that median rate is. So the other questions are, will hospitals actually subsidize this? Will they require practices to be in network with who they're in network with? And if that happens, what kind of leverage does the provider have? Because the insurance company recognizes, no, you've got to be in network with us. You don't really have much of a negotiating standpoint. So closing up, for healthcare reform, yep, if it's government driven, you might feel a little pricked, but don't worry about it. All right, so that's that. Are there any questions? Yes.
So how soon do you think there will be legislation on the surprise bills?
This year.
This year? Like
Yes.
an act that will be passed to curtail, that essentially means end up out of network?
Yeah, the question is, how soon will legislation be passed for these surprise bills? And the answer is this year. Legislation will be passed this year. And the Trump administration is very much wanting to sign bills for surprise billing. So I expect that in some form, this will happen. What form? Not sure. We'll take a look. Pay attention in September is when these things will be discussed, and the full House and full Senate will be voting on bills. But nonetheless, I can't see any way this is not going to get passed this year.
You expect that to be end up, because a couple of our providers do out of network. They're all exclusively out of network. That would actually mean end up out of network.
That would end it unless they had an agreement from the patients saying that, I know that, right. Yeah, so it would basically end out of network billing. Yes. I imagine it'd be going forward. For some of the legislation, actually, it starts in 2021, but it would be going forward. It would not happen immediately.
Starting, so you probably have another year.
Right, yes. So get those bills coming. Anything else? Any other questions? Yes?
So what will be kind of the reaction from the provider community given that this law?
It is, and the provider community reacted late, but they're now getting involved, and their focus really is on the fact that this is payer-centric, and pointing out how it damages providers to have this and prevents them from negotiating fair rates for their services, and that will lower patient access. And that's the primary argument that providers are now coming forward with. That may have some staying power, and so you may see some changes in the law which makes it more provider friendly. Yes. So the question is whether or not the law currently takes into effect rural health care and also special needs. And the answer is no. That's the position, that is the position of a number of specialty societies. And that is something which, again, may have an impact on the legislation prior to the time that it's passed. But that position is being pushed. Okay, well, yes.
Do you anticipate an increase in cash pay providers because of the median rate falling in some of the data that I guess on the provider?
Right. Yeah, that concierge medicine, yeah, I would expect. This is more of a personal judgment than a professional one, but I would expect that will increase. Yes, ma'am.
Provide insurance to, commercial insurance is also provided through employers and things of that sort. So how does that play out?
So basically, you're asking how do other nations do it, and why can't we? I suppose if I had that answer, I would have to donate to the Medicare Trust Fund. That's. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you very much then.